Hello, everyone. It's Wendy Liebmann. I'm the CEO and Chief Shopper at WSL Strategic Retail, and this is Future Shop. This is where I interview innovators, provocateurs, disruptors about the future of retail. Today, my guest is all three. His name is Dan O'Connor, someone I suspect is very familiar to many of you. He was the founder of MVI and the combined MVI Kantar, which sold to WPP. He's part of he's all involved and creator of RetailNet, which is the RetailNet group. He's an executive fellow at Harvard. So lots of fancy credentials here and more and many more. And he spends a lot of his time teaching us all and big CPG blue chip companies around the world about the future of commerce and about the future of work. So I am delighted to have him here today, a provocateur on the stage. Welcome, Dan.
Hi, Wendy. Thank you very much. Good to be with you.
It's always a pleasure. Dan, you and I, converge and separate and come back together around friends, clients, and industry events over the years. And what struck me, I think it was last fall, was where you were talking to a group that I was part of about this rather provocative notion of this concept or reality maybe of what you were talking about as 50-50 retail, and 50-50 retail or 50-50 commerce being 50 in digital and 50 in physical retail. And the whole room went like, oh my heavens, are we ready for this? Or is this just a provocation to get us ready? So how did you come to that point? And is that more to get us ready and scenario planning, or is this really what we should be thinking about right this moment?
Interesting, and I'm glad that stuck with you, Wendy. Let's all understand, I think we well understand actually, that digitalization is happening in every industry. And digitalization is happening in enabling e-commerce, obviously, and at the same time, digitalization and mechanization is coming to the physical store environment. And so when we think about digitalization, then it transcends all parts of the value chain, both in-person and not in-person retailing. And my forecast on the 50-50 world was really that 50% of commerce would happen not in person and 50% of commerce would happen in person. And that would happen initially in the B2C world, but with about a 5 or 8 year lag, it'll also happen in the B2B world, which is 6 times bigger than B2C. So it's really a profound shift when you begin to think about the implications of how products get to market, both the B2B elements as well as the B2C elements.
And as I thought about that after that session that you ran, I thought about all the ways, even in the sort of physical space, that digitization, digital, whatever, however you define it, will really have an impact as well. Because already we know, like, we walk into the store with our phone and we do homework or check prices or look at a review and all of that. So even if we're walking into a physical space, so often that digital factor is having an impact on that, right?
Yeah, it really does. And digitalization, of course, enables things to happen both with humans involved, but also in an automated way, as we're all beginning to understand in a very clear way. The byproduct of digitalization is data. And so data by definition then is historical. And so the key enabler here is to be able to leverage that data using automation and analytics in order to speed and improve the quality of decisions, whether it's an effort to personalize and better communicate with consumers or simply stay in stock, whether it's in a fulfillment center, a distribution center, or a store. So you're right, digitalization in and of itself is transformational and again, enables new models within e-commerce.
I was really struck by that because I know you've done a tremendous amount of work in China and understanding the Chinese market. And it struck me when one of our scouts, when one of our team were at HEMA in China and looking at their supermarket there, which I think is owned by Alibaba, if I get my thoughts straight today. And within that context, I mean, they were, the digitization was helping them manage the stock on the shelves, helping me as a shopper decide what I was buying, helping me with pricing, checking out. So many aspects of that, sort of what I would call the operational piece, to the piece that we are so involved in, which is the shopper. And so the way you're describing it really is the state of things increasingly everywhere, right? Not just in China.
Well, you're right, Wendy, in that I think you're referring to the HEMA model that's owned by Alibaba, and which we first experienced, I think it was in 2016. And the interesting thing about this retail venue is that, most products had a facing of one, maybe two. The entire baby section was about 4 feet wide, and that included, maybe 6 feet wide, but that included infant formula and diapers and so on. And more than half the restaurant was a series of in-store restaurants and different experiences. And the reason is because they only carry the first, sort of 2, 3, 4,000 highest velocity items, which candidly for most consumers is over 50% of what they buy. In some cases, it's 60 and 70% of what they buy. And they use nearby fulfillment centers to supplement what goes on in their stores. So they were the first ones really to model this new infrastructure of stores, fulfillment centers, really automated fulfillment, proximate fulfillment centers in the neighborhood. And then those in turn married to larger scale fulfillment centers and distribution centers. So it's a very interesting end-to-end solution with a very different consumer experience. Really different.
I didn't really intend to get into the middle of that, but as you say that, it reminds me of, the Ocado support for Kroger and all these smaller hub and spoke distribution centers they're creating in the Kroger markets around the US already. So that seems to be some kind of replica of what you're talking about in China as well.
Well, it's interesting. In most categories of especially fast-turning consumer goods, in the aggregate, the per capita consumption is reasonably flat. Some categories grow. And so if you assume that 100% of that used to be sold in person, and now in some categories, as much as 50% is being sold not in person, you can realize that that has a profound impact on the previous physical distribution network, the store, and the fulfillment centers or distribution centers that were connected to stores. And at the same time, and what's so profound about what they're doing at Kroger is they're creating a parallel but very different fulfillment model to reach the consumer, leveraging what I think is a very advanced and sophisticated technology from Ocado.
Yeah, it is amazing to watch those little automatons run around a distribution center. Is just mind-boggling. It's a stunning example of technology. All right, so back to some of the basics of the moment. So at least on the e-commerce side, one of the things we saw clearly through the pandemic was the, acceleration, the much overused word, of people buying online and having it delivered. And there was a sense then that, oh, wow, when you talk 50-50, which your discussion is slightly different from what we're talking about now, but that 50-50 piece, you could have looked at the scale at which sales through e-commerce grew. And then now we come 3 years almost to the day of the beginning of the pandemic, and we see this decline, or at least fall back to a more normal, quote unquote, level of e-commerce growth. How do you see that? How do you account for that? And what are we seeing, particularly in these economic times?
It is super interesting to me as I look at the world today, because as you know, Amazon just reported its first sort of flat to down quarter. It was profound and caused everybody to, pay close attention. I think, as you also know, it caused their stock, along with others, to, the market cap to fall by, 40, 50, 60%, at least against my basis. But the important thing is that there's no business model that we've ever experienced that went straight, that is right up to 100% household penetration. Instead, as you've seen me teach in the past, we're a big believer in S curves, that businesses grow and plateau and grow and plateau. And at the same time, If you just think back, Wendy, about the advent of the supercenter, for example, that ran at or even warehouse clubs. In the aggregate, those had an incredible 20 and 30-year run. In most cases, continue collectively to gain a lot of share. Well, when we reflect back on the launch of Amazon and the launch of eBay and the launch of Alibaba, these companies are now 20 plus years old, and the business model continues to grow and continues to capture share. There are moments in time where there is a flattening, and for some players, as you can see here today, there's some winners and some that are not winning quite as effectively. Secondly, I think we have a lot of new competition in the market today, and it's important for us to remember that Walmart.com is a consideration in the North American market. It's not just Amazon. Target.com is a consideration. And as importantly, we have, especially as consumers become adjusted to the idea of buying fresh foods and grocery online, Instacart is having an amazing impact on the size and scale of that is the level of engagement that consumers have from a digital retailing point of view. So the alternatives and competition are really out there. And at the same time, Wendy, if you can accept this, we're beginning to see a movement, especially in high impulse fashion categories, for example, including interestingly in consumer electronics, sort of the movement to what I call conversion marketing channels. And these are the TikToks and the Instagrams of the world, where, as you well know, as you sort of scroll through and look at your short reels and videos, that you're prompted to buy product. And it's surprising to me as an individual just how often I go look at something and end up buying, some shoes or something. Yeah. So there's real substitutes that are happening out there. And the very nature of competition is fragmenting the very nature of and spreading the growth out of the digital marketplace across more players.
So as we think about that and look at it, how do we as companies, whether it's CPG or fashion companies or tech companies, how do we have to, or retailers, of course, how do we have to think about this sort of fragmentation? I mean, I often think that, of course, our bias is through the lens of the shopper. And how do they need what they need when they need it? And that, 11 o'clock at night, oh, gee, I forgot the diapers.
Yeah.
Versus, oh, it's 11 o'clock at night and I have a moment to myself. Oh, look at those fabulous shoes, that kind of thing. So then there are category dynamics, right? And maybe channel dynamics. I mean, you spend a lot of time thinking about these things, and your Harvard lens and other examples of the work you do. How do I, as a big CPG company or a big retailer, really need to think about that complexity, that ecosystem now as we move forward?
Wendy, I'm going to come at this from two different angles. First, I'm going to come at it from, just a very big picture point of view. We've migrated through this world of physical retail, and we've seen lots of great ideas, and they continue to flow. And again, in the world are the majority of all consumption. So this, we've also seen the evolution of not in-person retailing from, the world of catalogs to the world of marketplaces and .com, Walmart.com and so on. And now we see the evolution of large-scale platforms. And as I've described, these sort of conversion marketing channels. And I think there's more to come. And again, what we're doing here is that we're just spreading a certain amount of volume over an increasing number of channels. I'm in the middle of a case right now writing about what I call super sellers, Wendy, and I've isolated a certain number of brand companies and sort of track their progression, because these are companies that have gotten from 0 to 100 million or 200 or 300 million or more digitally. And yet even today, even these super sellers, instead of growing at 30% a year, 20% of the year, are seeing single digit growth or slower growth rates. And so what I'm really trying to understand is what stands between them and getting back to 30% growth. Some of that is the consumer. Some of that is optimizing the way that they sell on their existing platforms. But some of that is also eyeballs are moving to alternate ways of engaging with product. And as you well know, Wendy, when eyeballs move, so does consumption. And that's what's going on in the marketplace today. TikTok, Instagram, and lots of other conversion marketing channels are really having an impact. And most recently, we have Ping Dao Dao entering the US with a model that is, I believe, going to have a profound impact on low value imported goods. It's very interesting how that's unfolding.
And you do get to look at some of these things now and say to yourself, and your lens of, literally eyeballs on this and the shopper. And, there is this sort of sense that, well, people don't have time. We're all looking at the time wallet discussion. People don't have time, so they want to do everything under one roof. And actually what we're realizing through our research is that people will shop in more places because in many times, many days, it is more efficient for them to be in more places. And by that, I don't mean jumping in the car and driving to the supercenter, but it could be, right? Sometimes I'm in, as you said, Walmart, sometimes I'm Walmart.com, sometimes Walmart's delivering to me, all of those sorts of things, which from a retailer standpoint and a manufacturer standpoint is a challenge. And then manufacturers doing, as you and I have talked about, marketplaces, their own marketplaces, third party, how are they doing all of that, and the complexity of that model, which is really interesting. We keep talking about this kind of personalized toolbox that shoppers have. And when you think about all the steps in the process and what a day in the life of a shopper can look like, it is really extraordinary in terms of different touch points. So how do you think about that if you're advising a company to either step back or step into this new world that we're talking about?
Yeah, Wendy, I think that, look, in the evolution of not in person, digital commerce, in the beginning, we saw these categories that were low weight, high dollar density, no temperature control. So music, video, apparel, these are categories that move first. And that's the first wave of digitalized merchandise. And then following that was product that was maybe a little bit lower dollar density. I call it sort of center of store merchandise. And more recently, as you well know, it's now included you'll find in all those Ocado centers that you're referring to, a full array of perishable and temperature controlled products. And all of that can be married into a single load. And now what I'm suggesting to you, however, is that as I look at the evolution and the fragmentation of the digital market, just the same way we have 70 different store types in the world today, we started off having one or two primary digital models, and we're on our way to 15 and 16 different digital models. So if you think about this from a brand or a seller point of view, my gosh, 70 store types, 15 or 16 digitalized mechanisms for getting to the consumer, selling models. And you find all of a sudden you've got lots of complexity, all of which have their own nuances, not just in terms of cost, but in terms of content and promotion and the way you support the product in each of those platforms. So as a seller, this world is not getting easier, it's getting more complex. Much more complex.
Yeah, and I know you do a lot of training around that and that whole sense of helping me learn how to even think about these things in a world that where we're looking for efficiency, where we've got shoppers who are looking for low price, where we've got, at least at the moment, and there's so many technologies that people are looking at, and we see in our certainly CPG clients, where are the white spaces for distribution opportunities, marketplace, 1P, 3P, what should I be doing? And then, of course, the whole conversation around retail media, and this talks to your comment about data, and all of that amount of data that's supposed to help us personalize the experience for shoppers, which sometimes works, and sometimes doesn't. So as you think about that and some of these issues, how should we step back now and think about how to think about these things? Is it just awareness and then looking at the structure you need?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And honestly, Wendy, I'm in the middle of this case and it's one of the hardest ones I've written. And the reason that it's hard is that even some of these great sellers in the world are really trying to figure out how you optimize, for example, selling through their own .com, optimize selling through marketplaces such as Amazon, and at the same time then have the capital and the people, because it's different skills and it does require money to go become efficient sellers in these other environments. So you're layering on this continuum of capabilities that is, it requires funding, it requires, sort of these capabilities to be effective. And even, for example, changes in the product. A more recent development that you might find interesting, Wendy, through this research that I've been doing is the valuations on pure play digital companies that are selling through this continuum of marketplaces and other digital opportunities. The valuation on these companies is actually very challenged right now. And what's so interesting is that what the capital markets are coming to discover is that the stability in the consumer base of a store-based retailer has great value. Where we talk about lifetime value of a consumer in alternate or digitalized shopping, and gosh, you're lucky to have somebody 3 years later, 4 years later. Whereas you well know, when you have a neighborhood grocery store, even if you're only penetrating 30 or 40% of the neighborhood around you, you tend to get a pretty good, and a stable base of consumers. And with a capability such as Instacart supporting that, you can, in effect, maintain and lock in on that consumer. So the value today, from a digitalization point of view, does include your ability to satisfy local need. Gosh, there's 1,000 items that are, 60 or 70% of what most people buy. You've got to be proximate. You've got to be fast. But what's really important is you've really got to hold on to that consumer. You've got to lock them in and you've got to hold them in. It's not a loyalty program issue. It's a way of competing in the different ways that consumers want to buy. And this is the complexity, Wendy. So as I look at the world today, I started to think about who the winners will be. And I think we're sort of past this mindset of omni-channel, this notion of harmonizing on and offline. So you have a common experience. I think that's a great idea. People have worked really hard at it. I think they make good progress. And now I think what a lot of, for example, large grocers and companies like Walmart, companies like Walmart are going to go all the way towards, I predict, building out a platform that looks a lot like maybe what an Alibaba would have, or one of the large scale Jingdong, its partner in China. I think that the Wegmans of the world and the ShopRites of the world, I think that they're going to find themselves in these federations. They're not going to build out quite as much of the capability, and they'll find themselves renting and connecting with capabilities, maybe even capabilities that Walmart is renting out to them. Or in fact, what I predict will happen is companies like Amazon will pull back from the store-based retail world. They'll run its marketplace, but it's really going to be in the business, I believe, through its cloud services of enabling these retailers that I'm describing, these store-based retailers, to compete in this new marketplace that I'm describing.
It's interesting you say that. We had Justin Honeman, who heads up one aspect of Amazon Web Services, and we were really talking about that whole aspect of their business and what they've learned from their physical stores, but that's not where they understand their growth is coming from in the longer term. And this ability, even this confederation, I think about a lot with the regional grocers, who are a perfect example, who did very well during the pandemic and continue to do well because they're local. It's exactly what you said. They're in my community. I know them. The balance of, as you say, in-person and not in-person offerings they have, but they're part of that very intense relationship with their shoppers in their communities, and the partnerships they create, even at IV with, shoe services or manicure services or whatever, to sort of flesh out their offer. And, some of that you can see, which seems sort of antithetical to the digital world we're looking at, and yet it's very much enabled by a lot of that. So that to me just supports what you were talking about more and more about the complexity of all of this. And then I look at, the Aldis and Costco's of the world, around the world. I just came back from Australia, and look at how quickly Aldi, over a 10-year period, just took a huge chunk of the grocery market in Australia to Costco. And you say, wait a minute, we've got all this digital stuff going on. What is it? These are, physical retailers for the most part. So much of that landscape, that picture you're painting, is really right in front of us.
Yeah, it's very interesting. You mentioned the discounters and the club, cash and carry, the Costco's of the world, because for both of those outlet types, they provide such extreme value at the quality that they choose to compete at. The consumer, is interested in digitalization, but not as dependent. And yet, if you look at mainstream retailers here in the U.S. and Europe, for example, it's really interesting, Wendy. There's some of these retailers, they have 60 and 70% of the volume in some of these large scale supercenters is being sold digitally, but being fulfilled in the store. And so I think you're going to see a lot of change in the U.S. market and European market in particular, North America, Europe, in that space will be redeployed from consumer space. And I think you'll see a lot more in-store micro-fulfillment centers or adjacent. HEB, for example, and companies like Hy-Vee are making a real commitment to, sort of try to figure out how to cleverly, create a fine in-person experience without having all the pick and pack people running up and down the aisles. And so I think the advent of this hybrid environment is going to really change the role and the probability of success of companies such as those I've mentioned.
Yeah. I also see that within the context of been thinking a lot about the, digital health lately.
Yeah.
And, as we think about all the digital services that were in place, but not really growing. And of course, now that, through the pandemic, we saw the use of, digital doctors and mental health professionals and nutritionists. And just the fact that for so many, particularly younger shoppers, but younger or patients younger or busy households, the ability to, click on and talk to the doctor before you actually have to go in somewhere. So I think a lot about that too, in terms of the digitalization of healthcare and how that impacts particularly the drug chains, but also any retailer that is offering broader healthcare services. So are you seeing that around the world too in some of the work you're doing, how healthcare is becoming much more digitized in terms of support?
Wendy, that from a GDP at a very big picture, retail is about 20% of GDP and healthcare is about the same, maybe slightly bigger. And once I don't want to call it dominated, but once you have significant share and a growing understanding of the consumer from one business or another, there's a lot of synergy back and forth. Common denominator is the consumer. And secondly, as I do, the things we eat have a huge impact on our health outcomes. So I think the future of healthcare and food, for example, in particular, will go hand in hand, maybe more than the delivery of health services. Yeah. Although, as you well know, companies like Walmart have committed now to expand the number of types of clinics they have on premise in their stores.
Dollar General talking about, so there we have small format value retailer, understanding that they have many underserved communities in the health space. So is it fresh or is it services? Is it, drive around vans that will help people get clinic services? I mean, it is extraordinary. You're right. Those two pieces to this.
They fit together so well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about, all our discussions around the ether about the metaverse and ChatGPT and the latest buzzwords of the world.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on all of that? Bright, shiny things of the moment, useful tools for shoppers?
So let's first say that the metaverse and everything around that, I think, is at the very early days. I think even the world's biggest sponsor of these initiatives, Meta, has repositioned its commitment pretty seriously, and saw its stock rebound significantly. And at the same time, I will say, Wendy, all of us know that the pressure on our cost structures and the need for deeper consumer insights and the need to compete with speed and with in-stock conditions and order fill rates, all of that, we all need to learn how to leverage data much more quickly to meet those goals. And so when you think about what Amazon's been doing, what Procter & Gamble's been doing, all sorts of large companies in terms of understanding what the biggest questions are and where the interruptions are in terms of the value delivery. They're often finding that using automation across the supply chain, and that includes automating cognitive tasks, for example, changing the way that things are forecasted, but also, as you well know, using mechanization all along that supply chain. And so I think the world of data, digitalization, automation is just going to accelerate. The opportunities are just enormous.
Well, some people find it very spooky. I mean, I talked to people while I was traveling in yes, Australia and New Zealand, small companies that are looking at their ability now to use data in ways that they couldn't have afforded to do, that will avail them of opportunities and growth, insights. It was just, there was a tremendous level of excitement. It wasn't just about kids faking their magazine,
Wendy, I can't believe the number of digital first companies that really are moderate users of their data.
Yeah. It's incredible,
And then,
right?
I'm sorry?
It's incredible.
It's incredible.
Right.
And where in the last 2 years, they've started to figure out what real personalization looks like and so on. So, the data use case. But what I would say is, from a human point of view, whenever an organization, enters into an automation agenda, our friends at P&G, we wrote a case with them about automation. And I think they would say to you that 20% of the workforce has low or no interest. And in other words, you can bring 80% of your workforce, and you need to bring 80% of your workforce into this future world. At the same time, you're going to have a percentage, as much as 20%, it could be higher, that you just have to realize that they're going to work in place in the same role for as long as you need them, with some understanding. But we've seen this in Japan. We've seen this in different markets around the world, where it's real work to transform an organization. It's real work. But what's in front of us, Wendy, is going to be a very, an incredibly improved consumer experience. I really believe that. And also, I think the very nature of how brands and retailers work is going to be redefined here in the next couple of years. As you've heard me say today several times, the curriculum I'm working on now is called the Next 2,500 Days. And the next 2,500 days is the time between today and the year 2030. And if you think about the transformation you're going to have to make by 2030, you can start working day by day and understanding it moves pretty quickly, and there's a lot to do. So I think we're going to see a lot of transformation, a lot.
And I actually, perfect wrap up, but when you first talked about 50-50 a few months ago, October or something, and I thought about that after, and you were talking, I think at least in China, about 2025. So that's been stuck in my head.
Yeah.
What do we all have to do? I'm not even taking your 2,500 days. I'm thinking about, what does the next 1,000 days look like? And what do we need to do? What can we get off our plate because of, digital tools? And what can we keep on our plate? And how do we use people more effectively at retail or in companies where they really can have the power to impact things? And so I don't think it's scary at all. My brain is exploding. But as always, you bring it into a perspective. You provoke us first, and then you help us see the road ahead. So I thank you for that. Always a great opportunity to chat with you, and I'll talk to you about the next 1,000 days before we get to 25.
Okay, fair enough.
Thank you, Dan. A pleasure as always.
Okay, bye, Wendy.
As always, Dan, incredibly provocative. That notion of what does the future of retail and shopping really look like? 2,500 days from now, he says it's going to be all totally different. I would suggest to you better start thinking about the next 1,000 days, because you don't start right away. You're never going to get to 2025, and that notion of digitization and how it's touching every aspect, not just 71 different points of distribution or physical channels, but another 16 digital channels. That doesn't make your head spin about the future of retail. well, I don't know what will or does. So see you in the future, the very near future.